Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Caroline Smith. I am our digital programs coordinator, and we're here this evening to showcase some history about the York County Conservation District. But before I jump into that, I do want to share some other upcoming programs that we have with the History Center. The first being in a couple weeks, November 28th, we have Bookmarked, which is our Zoom book club. And the book for this month will be Murder and Mayhem in York County. So true crime. And we'll also have the author joining us for that program. As well, December 1st, we'll have Writers Roundtable at the Historical Society Museum with Greg Haplin. December 2nd, we'll have First Friday Lantern Tours at the Colonial Complex. And December 15th, we'll be talking about Pennsylvania's canals on Zoom with Matt Maris. So looks like we have a good group going so far. So I'm going to hand it over to Michael and he can start his presentation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Caroline.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so as I mentioned a little bit ago, my name is Michael McKelvey. I work for the York County Conservation District in the role of Education and Communications Coordinator. So it's my job to handle all the public outreach, educational programs, and that sort of thing. I do run the York County Envirothon as well, which is our environmental education program designed to reach students from 3rd grade up to senior high and teach them all about the environment and everything like that. So kind of like my position is one of the core aspects of what the conservation district is. It's our job to conserve our natural resources here in York County. And one of the most powerful ways that we can do that is through education and outreach and teaching folks about, what's the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do when it comes to conserving natural resources. So we are facing a very exciting milestone here at the York County Conservation District. Here in a few months in 2023, it will actually be our 75th anniversary of the Conservation District. So throughout the year, we are taking opportunities such as this here today to speak about the history of the Conservation District and just see how far we've come really here in York County and highlight all those accomplishments of the hard workers who came before us here in York County. So I sincerely appreciate your time being here today, taking some time out of your day to learn a little bit more about the Conservation District. I hope it's going to be worth your while. And as I mentioned, as I kind of start my talk here, please feel free to ask questions. I strongly encourage you to do so. I hope we can get a little discussion going. So feel free to raise your hand in Zoom or send a question in the chat or however that works best here in this format. And I'll try my best to answer your question. Or if you want to hold your questions to the end, that's fine as well. So I guess just a very basic overview of the Conservation District. We are the county level environmental regulatory agency, if you will. So there's, you have EPA at the federal level, DEP at the state level, and then you break that down even more, you get down to the county level. And as a conservation district, we perform a number of tasks kind of delegated from the state. But as the conservation district, we are the boots on the ground here in York County. We interact directly with farmers, landowners, excavating companies, construction companies, anybody that owns land or is in some way operating with that land. We're in direct communication with them and just trying to make sure that everybody's making the right choices. But as we look at the history of it, there obviously was a time when the conservation district did not exist as we look back. And, it kind of traces back when I start to look at where did the conservation district really come from, I kind of found myself, I looked all the way back to the year 1736, which was not the beginning of the conservation district, but it was the first evidence I could really find of conservation practices here in York County. Was in the year 1736, and that was seen in documented crop rotations here in York County. What I found showed that they had a rotation of wheat followed by rye, corn, oats, and then allowing the field to lay idle for 2 years and then repeating the cycle. But I thought this was really interesting, and I like to start with this because it shows that, farmers here in York County were thinking about the integrity of the soil and their natural resources way back, all the way back into the 1730s. And so, fast forward real quick, I don't know, 70 years or so, you get to the year 1800. And, from what I could see, York County actually exhibits the first recorded application of lime, then known as clover plaster, on soil in the country. So pretty interesting stuff. That's what's neat about York, is that we have so much history here that in many ways we have a lot of these firsts in the nation. And when we look at conservation, that's no exception. We have a long history with agriculture in York County, and in many ways we ended up being towards the leading edge of these conservation efforts as they go hand in hand with agriculture. So we're going to jump forward in time a little bit, again, about another 130 years to about 1930, let's say 1933. Okay. Most people cite the dawn of the conservation districts as being correlated with the Dust Bowl, right? That's this horrific agricultural disaster in the Midwest, and we talk about the Dust Bowl and we say, well, was it a natural disaster? Was it a human disaster? Probably a little bit of both, maybe leaning a little towards the human side, a settlement being encouraged in the Midwest, agriculture being encouraged in ways that was not sustainable. And, when the drought then hit 1933 or so, those unsustainable agricultural practices really came back to bite us. Quick note, 1933, is also Franklin D. Roosevelt. Is elected, I believe, in 1932 and takes office, I believe, in 33 or around that time approximately. And he takes the reins. And this is kind of like the first we can see of like government beginning to think about regulating how we deal with our soil because it blew away. So in 1934, I see documentation that the Dust Bowl actually blew clouds of soil all the way to Pennsylvania. So imagine it's 1934 in York County and you're a farmer and it's raining dirt from the Midwest onto your fields, which it may be startling. And that's kind of when we see it start to become a relevant issue in the East Coast and in Pennsylvania, because you couldn't ignore it. It was right there in front of us. And in 1935, we see President Roosevelt sign the soil, and we see the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, that army of hardworking dudes who are planting trees and building national parks or whatever. The CCC begins to act in Pennsylvania, and around that time they begin to act in York County, and that's kind of how they start trying to implement some of these measures to stop us from losing our soil. In York County, we didn't necessarily have the high winds that you would see in the Midwest, and the conditions were not quite as drought stricken. We did face droughts for sure, but we faced a slightly different concern in York County, which was actually just the rain in general. It wasn't so much that all of our soil, our precious topsoil that is needed for our farms, it wasn't that it was blowing away so much as it was washing away. If you're farming and tilling your soil on a hill and you get a torrential downpour, a significant amount of that soil is going to leave your property looking like chocolate milk in the most nearby adjacent stream. So that was what we faced largely in York County. And, in 1938, this is something the farmers are concerned about, in York County, because that's their livelihood. If all the topsoil on your farm washes away, your farm ceases to exist. So in 1938, a number of farmers got together, led by a farmer by the name of W.F. Dummer, who was a dairy farmer in York County. He got together with something like 554 different farmers across 18 townships, and he got them all to sign a petition, basically that they would form a pact, that they would work together, largely based on handshakes, and they would work together and share their accomplishments. They would share their conservation farming techniques, and they would do what they could to keep the soil there, because each farm was not an island. In many ways, farms, wrapped around each other, or you had a farm up the hill from another farm, and these farms, the practices impacted each other. And so they tried to form this pact in 1938, then known as the York Soil Conservation District. So that's like dawn of the conservation district is this petition that's signed amongst these farmers. So next year, 1939, all these township supervisors, they get together and they develop a plan of attack. What are we going to do? They develop a general soil conservation program based on soil surveys, erosion surveys that existed at the time. By this time in 1939, they had about 3 years of proof or of evidence of those civilian conservation corps camps that were basically experimenting with these tactics, these different farming tactics, ways to shape the land, ways to plant crops along the contour, for example. So that those camps in and around Glen Rock, being run by the CCC, they put together an extensive list of what worked and what didn't work in that 3-year period of time. They actually had done work on 155 farms in those 3 years in and around Glen Rock. And so this is what shaped the plan of attack, so to speak, for the York Soil Conservation District in 1939. In the year that followed, moving into 1940, the Soil Conservation District developed conservation plans for 40 farms for a little bit over 4,000 acres. So in 1 year, they planned out, here's what we're going to do to conserve the soil on about 4,000 acres in York County. And all that was done basically through 5 volunteer directors. So at that point, there were no paid staff for the conservation district, the soil conservation district. It was just 5 unpaid volunteer directors working together to kind of organize all of these farmers. And of course, this is all entirely voluntary for these farmers at this point. Excuse me, there's no enforcement. There's really no incentive coming from is the visible proof that these practices work and they keep the topsoil on your farm. So, we're at this point, we're at the year 1940, okay? The Soil Conservation District is in its infancy, but it's growing rapidly because farmers are seeing there's ways that with little additional input, monetary input, they can increase their productivity and they can preserve their resources so that they can continue to farm in the future. And this is a really fascinating point in history, in my opinion, because you have this beginning scare from the Dust Bowl, where these conservation programs are taking hold because farmers and legislators, lawmakers saw what can go wrong. They saw, oh my goodness, all of our topsoil could blow away and we could lose our ability to produce goods via agriculture. But as you get into the early 1940s, it was like this perfect storm where these programs started to develop, but there wasn't a whole ton of money to fund this kind of thing. And in the early 1940s, around 1942, you start seeing a great push from the federal government to try to increase agricultural productivity because we were going to war, in World War II. So, as you read through these past newspaper articles and stuff like that, you see all these urges for farmers to do whatever they can do to increase their productivity. So at that point, you have less and less people potentially being able to work on farms as men are, heading to service, while also having a higher demand for these agricultural goods. And so at that point, you had half a decade or so of these conservation practices being implemented and seeing that they worked and that they increased productivity without really having to apply more like fertilizer, or basically it would minimize the amount of fertilizer you would need to apply to increase your yields. And so you started to see these federal programs start to push these farmers to implement these conservation measures to increase their productivity for the war effort, which it's always fascinating to me to look back at some of the stuff. And you look at the development of conservation through history, and it's not necessarily always, or it wasn't always about saving the environment necessarily. There was often a real economic driver behind this, and in the early 40s, that's what you see with it. And so 43, 44, 1945, you have Pennsylvania passes a conservation district law, which allows counties to legally adopt a conservation district office. So basically, they could absorb a soil conservation district and have that be a county governmental agency. And so through 1945, 1946, the growth of and support of these conservation programs is just skyrocketing. I mean, there's some statistics here, but it's just like year over year was just exponential growth in the number of farmers that were cooperators. So, and what that means is farmers willing to cooperate with the district, and kind of that they are basically with a handshake and a signature, they're saying, we will agree to implement these measures if you help tell us what measures we're supposed to implement. And so those are the cooperators. But you see a huge increase in the number of cooperators and in the amount of acres being in which conservation measures are being implemented during these years. So in 1947, I pulled this excerpt from the 1947, this is riveting, I promise, 1947 Soil Conservation District Annual Report. They say, your county has long been known for its thrifty, conservative farmers. For years, these farmers were reluctant to change from square field farming to the conservation programs as recommended by our district. Yet, each year, interest in conservation of soil and water grew. More and more farmers became cooperators with the district, and the public began to see where they were to benefit by a sound soil conservation program. And I just love that excerpt, but it was clear that the desire for these programs was there. And so I believe they struck while the iron was hot. And in 1948, York County adopts a resolution to formalize the entire county a conservation district. So up to that point, from 1938, from 1938 up till then, it was only 18 townships in the county. And it wasn't a county governmental agency. However, in 1948, they say, okay, all of York is now the York County Conservation District. So that, that's the start of our 75 years there. But this was monumental. We were not the first county in the state to adopt a conservation district countywide. However, we were the first in 1949 to mark 1,000 farmers cooperating. So we were growing very rapidly. Part of that is due to York's agricultural history. We just had a lot of farmers. I see we have a question relating to cooperating farmers, and I would love to answer that.
Yes. So thinking not only in terms of those folks who started as the cooperating farmers, do we have any family farms that are still in existence that you recognize from those original groups?
That is a really good question. I don't know off the top of my head. I know many of the farms have been passed down generation to generation. But that would be a question that I would have to ask one of our agricultural specialists, and they may know. The fascinating thing with it is that I can almost guarantee they would know, because the district and its relationship with farmers has very much been just that. It's been building relationships with these farmers over decades. And that's kind of the unique thing, is that since we're not really like an enforcement agency with farmers, we're more like there to help them. So, in some cases, we've been having these conversations with farmers for decades. So I would not be in the least bit surprised, but I cannot name any that I know of that would date back to the 30s or the 40s. But that was a great question, and thank you for asking. So yeah, we're in the year 1949 approximately, and the conservation district is growing. The word is spreading at this point. I mean, the landscape by this point in many areas of York County has visibly changed. As you go through and you see the farming practices changing, you see multiple different crops, in strips and things to that effect. And so it at this point, it has taken off pretty well. And with 1950 or so, we begin to see a new, no pun intended, a new branch of the conservation district, with its beginning of seedling distribution, a reforestation effort, if you will. It was clear that one of the most cost-effective ways to keep the soil where it needs to be, is to plant trees, shrubs, to keep it covered by some type of vegetative growth. So around 1950, the conservation district really starts to ramp up its seedling distribution program. And some of you may know, if you're familiar with the conservation district at all, we offer a seedling sale now. And this really began around 1950. In the year 1950 alone, the conservation district distributes almost 350,000 trees across the county, trees and shrubs and stuff like that. And in around 1950, 1951, how this was possible in many cases was through a very unique partnership with the Gladfelter Pulp Company, or now known as the Gladfelter Paper Company, or really now known as Pixel. But back then, Gladfelter Pulp Company, they source hundreds of thousands of trees, of seedlings, bare root seedlings, little seedlings, maybe a foot, 8 inches to a foot high, and they start planting them. At first, at no cost to farmers. Something like, they would plant 1,000 trees in an acre. And that was the minimum you could get, was 1,000. And it cost $6. And they would plant them for you. The Gladfelter Pulp Company also made available, purchased and basically lent out this seedling planting machine. That if we can jump into this, let's see if I have an image here that Caroline may be able to share of what this kind of looked like, what the reality of the conservation district looked like at that point. Um, on the first page there, we have the this seedling planting device, which I think is hilarious, but also effective. You can see two guys sitting on the back of this planter being pulled by an old Jeep with chains on it across a farmer's field that they wish to reforest. And these the guys in the back, that machine was digging a trench, and they would every 6 feet or whatever, they rang a bell as they're moving at a steady pace, and one guy would stick the tree down in the ground, and then the machine would pull the dirt over it in the back. And by doing this, they were actually able to plant like thousands of trees in a day, plots, like multiple acres a day, in an effort to get these trees growing. And throughout the year, they would plant at minimum 50,000 trees a year, doing this. So I thought this was really interesting to see, and just kind of see what that really looked like on the ground back then. But that was then, and that became a core tenet of the conservation district, was trying to get these trees in the ground. You go to the next year, 1951, 100,000 trees they plant on cooperators farms. Now there was one stipulation. You're planting things like evergreens, mostly is what they were planting. There was one stipulation, and it was that the trees were not to be used, and they were not to be cut and used as Christmas trees. So they didn't care what you did. And you'll notice they kind of add like a fine print at the end that's like, the landowner is free to harvest these trees or sell them as they would like in the future when they're mature. So, I mean, there was an incentive for the Gladfelter Company in one way, because they were planting their future harvest of pulpwood, but the side effect was that they got to reforest vast swaths of York County, and plant these trees at a very rapid rate, just so long as farmers didn't cut them down as Christmas trees. So, over the couple years, yada, 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 the prices go up a little bit. By 1952, you'd have to pay a whopping $15 to have 1,000 trees planted on your property. And we start to see trickled in throughout 1950 through the 1950s, some more environmental regulations, early environmental regulations start to take form. In 54, you have the passage of the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act. And so we started looking at conservation measures, not just as keeping soil there, but also wise use of the land, and wise use in the way that we're shaping the land to make sure that we're not exacerbating flood risk, and when possible, we're reducing flood risk. You see a lot of you'd see a lot of development of farm ponds, of channeling the water in certain ways. And that's what it was back then. Honestly, there was a lot of earth moving involved in conservation. The conservation district actually contracted with a excavating company to dig like farm ponds at a discounted rate, so that it would be something that would be feasible for farmers. And so they were kind of killing multiple birds with one stone. They were stockpiling water in case of drought to irrigate their fields and prevent the Dust Bowl scenario. They're also strategically catching the water so it doesn't wash out, create gullies, that sort of thing. And so, you see this happening. And what I love about looking at that period in history was it was just so, it was so much about like the boots on the ground. It was about putting change on the ground. It was about hiring hiring some guys to sit behind a planter and plant trees all day. It was a very direct, tangible, you could see ground immediately. And that's very unique. Now, granted, back then they didn't have all of the permitting requirements and everything that you may have to go through now. If they wanted to build a farm pond that was 5 acres, they could just take a more or less take a bulldozer out there and make the farm pond and stuff like that, which is not how it works anymore. But long story short, it was about getting change made on the ground at that point in time. 1955, the district now has nearly 1,800 cooperators, cooperating farms and farmers in York County. So you can see it's growing very rapidly. It nearly tripled in 10 years. 1956, you see the passage of the Soil Bank Act, which authorized which authorized the payment of financial assistance to farmers for them to put some of their cropland into grasses and trees. So we see programs like that now, and they kind of grew from this. And in 1956, we also see one of the first kind of encounters between the county and the county government and the conservation district, where again, there's almost an ulterior motive, but the county highways division starts to really support the conservation district because so much dirt was being washed onto the roads at that point in time that it was like ungodly expensive for them to maintain the county roads, because all the farm fields dirt would wash onto the roads and then they would basically have to scoop it all off every year. They estimate in 1956 that they would remove 64,000 tons of soil from county roads and gutters along the road. And so you start to see this cooperation between the conservation district, and you start to see county funding and support for the conservation district because it saved them so much more money. If farmers could implement these proper conservation practices, not only does the soil stay on the fields, it stays out of the roads, makes it cheaper to maintain. So, and around that period of time, the responsibility for these programs starts to shift from the federal government to the state level. So the federal government kind of stops footing the bills quite as much, and they say this is going to be up to the states to fund and continue to fund these programs. The budget was cut in half basically in 1958. And so the states had to pick up the tab and figure out how to make it allow it to continue. Just another fascinating snapshot in history. 1958, the York County Conservation District actually has they have a beauty pageant centered around farm life. So they would actually, and this would go to like a state competition amongst all the counties for a woman who lived on a farm basically and lived a farm life. So just very interesting kind of history there. And I love this headline, 1958, as we're talking about these funding struggles from the federal government to the state, the York County doubles the allocation for the York County Conservation District. And they doubled the amount of money for the district's budget to $500 for the entire year, which at the time was great. But it shows just how much has changed in that amount of time. But $500 could make it happen for the year with the budget when you didn't have any staff and it was all volunteers working together to get this stuff done. 1959, we celebrate the 20th anniversary. And I have an image here somewhere of just like I think it's page 5. We have just the flyer for the 20th anniversary, which I love looking at as we look at our 75th anniversary and just seeing how these milestones were celebrated. There we go. Thanks, Caroline. Seeing how these were celebrated then just as much as now. I mean, 20 years of the conservation district was a great accomplishment at that point in time. And with that 20-year anniversary, coincidentally, we actually marked 2,000 cooperators. So you see the program continuing to grow into the early 60s. 1961, an interesting tie-in to the, as we talk about history here, the York Historical Society Museum actually gets a conservation exhibit. They received a large watershed exhibit of the layout of the county, so you could see how the water actually the watershed works, how the water would flow downstream, Cadorus Creek into the Susquehanna, and just trying to show people in York County what the landscape actually is and how that water flows. And just a lot starts to happen at that point in time. You know, you see development of these state programs. I think another one of my favorite bits of history here, and I try to tell this story in a way that it shows how larger historical trends shaped conservation, just like they shaped everything else. But you know, we're talking about farmers, we're talking about soil health. But in 1963, there's headlines here that we read that show that the soil technicians, I have the press release on page 8 of the document here, but soil technicians for conservation in 1963 were trained in the use of Geiger counters, because of, you know, you're looking at the Cold War period, and basically the federal government knew that the soil technicians were actually, again, they were the boots on the ground on these farms. So they trained them in the use of Geiger counters, and they would effectively be first responders in the fields of York County should there have been an atomic attack. So they would go out, they would read the soil, as they do for their job. They would read the soil, test it for radioactive fallout, and if needed, they would communicate with the farmers and instruct them of their next steps, you know, as farmers, what they would need to do, whether it was safe to harvest their crops, whether it was not safe to harvest their crops, you know, stuff like that, which is just, to me, is just fascinating. I mean, it's like you think about the daily life of a soil conservation technician at that point in time, going around, checking the slope of a field, you know, seeing if it meets the conservation plan, but now they also need to potentially be checking for radioactive fallout. And it, you know, it shows those aspects of history touched, you know, every facet of even something like conservation. 1964, the York County Commissioners get serious, or continue to get serious, about conservation, and they establish Soil Stewardship Week via a resolution, so that we would take 1 week every year and just focus on, you know, being good stewards of our soil. You know, and in those during the 60s, you see a lot of these other projects statewide. You start seeing more state money come to these programs. You see the groundbreaking for Lake Marburg, Cadorus State Park, you know, that lake. That was a cooperative effort between, again, Gladfelter Pulp Company and the state funds. But these programs that changed the landscape in York County, you know, and through the 50s there, the conservation district starts to get employees. They actually got an employee in the 1950s, which was a great accomplishment. And it's not until later in the 50s or early 60s that they get a second employee. I read that actually the second employee, I believe they received their second employee in 1972. And unfortunately, that employee actually passed away like mere months after they were hired. And then they're back to one. So, you know, they face these challenges then too. Another catalyst in the history of the conservation district that really kind of pushed a lot of these efforts to get serious was Hurricane Agnes in 1972. Just like destroyed vast swaths of farmland and stream banks. And so then it became an effort of restoration. And again, like we saw with the Dust Bowl, you have these natural disasters that wreak havoc. And then we start looking to the future and saying, okay, well, like, what can we learn from this? How can we do things differently in the future to be better protected and be more resilient against these kind of weather events? And so from that, you see more support for things like stream bank restoration, and again, just conservation practices on farms. Another one of my favorite tidbits of conservation district history is that in 1973, the Cadorus Creek, it was no joke that, or it was no secret that the Cadorus Creek was really polluted. And part of the issue was that sewage kept getting dumped into the creek. from York or surrounding areas. And so there was a effort to figure out what is the best way to stop this from happening. How do we stop from dumping sewage into the Cadorus Creek? And the Army Corps of Engineers drafted what they called the Water Spray Land Irrigation Project, which was more or less effectively a plan to just like spray like all of the sewage over approximately a 17,000 acre area and just let it, naturally work down through the soil. Yeah, so for a number of reasons, that maybe was not a good idea. Maybe it would have been fine, but the Conservation District Board actually put their foot down at this point, and they worked with the county commissioners to draft a resolution. And this was like they drew the line in the sand, and it stopped that program from being implemented. And instead, the Conservation District strongly requested that basically we figure out a way to treat the sewage, and then the water as clean water can go back into the water supply. And so eventually, I mean, obviously that's kind of what happened. We figured out a way to treat that water, and so it's not going back into the environment as sewage. So, I'm getting towards the end here of my first 50 years of Conservation District history. But I'm hoping that this kind of casts something of a picture of what this initial 50 years, what I consider to be a pretty exciting time in York County Conservation District history, because so much was changing. In 1975, we finally stop our massive seedling distribution fire hose. And by that point, we had planted millions of trees in York County. And at that point, it transitions to more of an individualized sale, where if any of you have participated, you may be familiar with this seedling sale format a little bit more, where you could buy 10 seedlings for $1 instead of 1,000 for $15. And it just, at this point, really, the Conservation District is forming more what it is that we see it as now. We've taken on staff, we've expanded. We start hiring more and more people, especially with the organization and adoption of the Chesapeake Bay program in 1983. That was really that was a huge deal for getting us to where we are today, and kind of shaped what conservation districts are now. Because at that point, it was no longer about us just losing soil. It was about making sure that we're not polluting the Chesapeake Bay, and realizing that what we do here in York County has an impact beyond just here in York County. And so with that, you see additional federal money, which means additional support from the state, which means we can get more staff and we have a larger budget. And I get to have a job, for example. And a lot of that came from support for the Bay program and just kind of that happening. As well as in 1985, we have our first ever York County Envirothon, then known as the Enviro Olympics, which it had that name right up until the actual legitimate Olympic committee sent a cease and desist letter saying, stop using the name Olympics, it's a copyrighted thing. So, and obviously they cooperated. They came up with the name Envirothon. And that has continued now in York County. It will be going into its 38th year this year, which is another great accomplishment. And from that point, we could fast forward right up to here and now, where I'm here talking to you folks about a lot of the things that we've been talking about for decades, right? It's just kind of what can we do to make sure that the resources are able to be enjoyed by us, but also there for future generations. So I guess at this point, I would love to kind of just, if we have any questions, or if we want to just talk about maybe some of the stuff I went through, maybe in greater detail, or anything else with the Conservation District, I'd be happy to talk through it.
It appears we have some questions.
Great.
So the first one is, when did the York County Soil Conservation District become simply known as the York County Conservation District?
Great. So technically on paper, that would have been 1948. However, when you look back through historical documents like newspaper articles and stuff like that, it's construed for decades. I mean, you would read stuff in the 60s or 70s that still called it the York Soil Conservation District. You got the York Conservation District, you got your York County Conservation District, so but technically it was adopted into being the York County Conservation District in 1948.
We also have another question, going back to the radioactive soil or possibility.
Sure, yeah.
Could you explain the reasoning behind doing that?
No. Yeah, I mean, I can try to explain, I don't really know. I think that a lot of that was, I mean, you could maybe chalk that up to like Cold War hysteria kind of thought process in the early 60s when I mean, you see fallout shelter stuff. I'm sure there's buildings in York that still have the fallout shelter insignia. I mean, you'd have schools being trained with, how to sit under your desk or something if there was an atomic attack. Maybe it was just to show that we were doing something to be prepared. Now it wasn't something where as far as I understand it, the soil technicians, I don't think were just going out there every day, just wandering through a field with a Geiger counter. I think they were trained. I think they were provided with the equipment, and then they were instructed in the case of an event that this is what you would do. And that's about all I can garner from it. We have some of the press releases from the time, some of the articles kind of explaining that to the public. I'm not sure I can totally explain the rationale behind like the federal government deciding to do that, but it's a great question.
Right, and then also tying back to the first iteration of the seedling sale,
Sure.
does the conservation district still have ties with Gladfelter today?
Not really. No. Well, first of all, the Gladfelter company has transitioned, as of, I don't know, however many couple years ago, to Pixel or Pixel. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but the short answer is no. I mean, throughout the years, maybe they may have sponsored the Envirothon for a year or two here or there. But that close-knit relationship is not, at some point that kind of seems to have gone away in history, maybe around the 70s, somewhere in there.
And then this is just a personal question of mine.
Sure.
I can't remember if you're from the local area or not, but did you ever participate in Envirothon as a kid?
Good question. I did not actually. So I did not participate in the Envirothon. When I was in school, my school didn't have the program, unfortunately, and I just wasn't even aware of it. So, but that's a major push for us too, is just trying to get the awareness out of that program. This year we're looking at hopefully at least 75 different school buildings across the county and upwards of 150 or more teams. So we're hoping to hit approximately 1,000 students this year. That's kind of our goal every year, is get 1,000 students involved.
And going back to when you mentioned the Dust Bowl,
Yeah.
would you happen to know if the district has any like photographs of like the debris that was making its way to Pennsylvania?
Well, again, unfortunately, the district was not in existence when that was happening. So it really wasn't until 1938 that you had any form of the district. And even then, it was not the agency that you would think of it as today. So we do have some records, and it's honestly impressive that we have any records from like 1938 that somebody at that time they were like, we're making history. Let's store this away. But yeah, I'm sure that there are images out there somewhere, but I don't have them in our archives. However, I did read in one that it was it actually, and again, I can't vouch for this being accurate because it was just in a newspaper article, but it was said that it actually, I think 1935 maybe, that it snowed red in the soil particulate matter in the atmosphere mixing with snow, and then the snow coming down in a reddish hue, which that's crazy.
Right, I think that's all of the questions that have come in this evening. Thank you so much for sharing that great history with us, Michael.
Absolutely, Caroline. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for everyone who took some time to listen. If you ever want to learn more, feel free to check out our website or send us an email, and we'll be happy to talk.
Wonderful. And we'll be sure to post this on our social media channels with any links to the Conservation District if folks have any additional questions. So thank you all for joining us this evening.